By the time the torches were lit for the victory feast in Stornhall, the smell of roasted boar and spilled ale had almost managed to bury the smell of blood that still clung to the warrior's mail. Almost, but not entirely, because men who have won too recently always carry the battlefield into the hall with them, no matter how loudly they try to drown it in song. On the high seat beneath the carved raven beams sat Jarl Asmund of Stornhall, heavy-shouldered, iron-bearded, and less triumphant than the cheers below him demanded. His hall had won the battle at Black Slope 3 days earlier, breaking the winter raid of the Ashfang orcs and burning their timber camp to the roots. Victory, however, had come with enough dead that every bench in the hall held at least one man drinking harder, because someone who should have sat beside him no longer could. That did not stop Asmund's younger son Rurik from treating the feast as proof that the gods themselves preferred his violence to anyone else's caution. Rurik strode through the hall with bright mail, a wolf fur cloak, and the kind of grin that looks most at home on men who mistake fear in others for admiration. He had led the final charge at Black Slope and returned with a gash across one cheek that only made him seem prouder of himself. To Rurik, the feast was not merely for victory but for display. And the greatest display of all was the woman forced to walk among the benches carrying mead to the men who had destroyed her people's camp. Her name was Vesha Stone-Voice, though very few in Stornhall knew it yet, and even fewer understood what the second half of that name truly meant. They saw only an orc woman in rough servant linen over torn leathers, her wrists ringed by bruises where restraint ropes had been too tight, her dark braids cut unevenly by a battlefield knife, and her green face held still by exhaustion and pride together. She moved with the careful balance of someone who had already learned that spilling a pitcher in a victor's hall can invite more pain than open defiance. Vesha had been taken alive, not because the men who captured her admired mercy, but because Rurik thought humiliation more entertaining than a clean death. At Black Slope, she had not stood in the shield line with spear and axe, but among the rear fire circles, keeping the death names, binding wounds, and calling the crossing songs for the dying. Among the Ashfang, memory belonged not to stone monuments but to living voices, and Vesha's voice had long been counted one of the clearest in the winter camps. She was the niece of Hradka Wolf Mother, matriarch of the Ashfang, and the chosen namekeeper for that season's war band. Her duty had been to remember every fallen orc so that no one vanished into mud and snow without witness. The Vikings who overran the camp had not understood the bone markers, the tally strings, or the inked strips of hide tied at her belt. But they understood well enough that the woman kneeling among the dying mattered somehow. Rurik had seen her kneel over his wounded brother Bjorn at the edge of the burned stockade, and had taken from that sight not gratitude but suspicion sharpened by pride. He ordered her bound before she could flee with the surviving Ashfang, and when his men asked why he wanted a singer alive, he said every hall drinks sweeter when its enemies pour the cup. That sentence had followed Vesha into Stornhall like a curse spoken aloud too often. Since arriving at the hall, she had been kept near the brew room under guard, given enough food to stand, enough water to sing if ordered, and enough cruelty to remind her every hour that survival and dignity had become separate negotiations. Yet even captive, she watched and listened with the disciplined attention of a keeper of names, because a person charged with memory does not cease gathering truth merely because iron hands her a different room. She learned quickly that Stornhall's victory did not sit cleanly on the household that claimed it. Jarl Asmund's eldest son Bjorn had not returned from Black Slope alive, and though the hall shouted Rurik's name now, the shadow of the dead brother hung over every cheer. Bjorn had been the steadier son, slower to anger, broader in mercy, and widely expected to inherit Stornhall before the battle stripped future into a harder shape. His sister Astrid, sharp-eyed and composed as winter water under ice, moved through the feast preparations like someone keeping an entire building from collapsing around the grief of others. She oversaw food, servants, and wounded men's portions with more command than many captains, yet every time Rurik laughed too loudly, her mouth hardened almost imperceptibly. There was also old Halfdan, the law speaker, white-bearded and bent but not weak, who watched Vesha with a recognition he had not yet explained. On the first night of her captivity, he heard her humming under her breath in the brew room and had gone pale in a way no mead fumes could account for. Halfdan had spent his youth on trade voyages farther north than most in Stornhall had ever sailed, and he knew more of old border customs between fjord folk and mountain clans than Rurik considered useful knowledge. The old man said little, but Vesha saw that he heard not just a captive's voice when she sang softly to herself, but an echo from a deeper time the hall had largely forgotten. Captain Ivar, meanwhile, stood between worlds as hard soldiers often do, loyal to his jarl, loyal in his way to order, and increasingly uneasy with the games Rurik liked to play when drink and victory mixed. He had taken no pleasure in the handling of captives after Black Slope, though he had obeyed the commands given. More than once he had told the younger guards that no one was to touch the orc woman without cause, and more than once Rurik had mocked him for growing old before his beard had even gone grey. The morning of the feast, Astrid found Vesha grinding spices in the lower kitchen and asked, more directly than anyone else so far, whether the leg wound she had taken at Black Slope still bled through the wrapping. Vesha answered that it bled less than the men who celebrated above her seemed to think, which earned the briefest flicker of reluctant respect from the Jarl's daughter. Astrid said only that if Rurik pressed her too far before the hall, she should keep her eyes on the high seat and not on the benches. Vesha asked whether the high seat was meant to offer mercy or merely a better witness to humiliation. Astrid replied that she did not yet know which her father still possessed in greater quantity. Before dusk, Rurik came himself to inspect the feast arrangements, stopping by the brew room long enough to lift Vesha's chin with the back of his hand, as though examining livestock before market. He told her she would pour mead first for the warriors who took the stockade wall, and then for the men who dragged down the Ashfang banners. After that, he said, she would sing something fitting for losers, a dirge perhaps, so the hall might enjoy hearing defeat in the throat of one who survived it. Vesha stared at him with a silence more dangerous than pleading and said nothing. Rurik took her silence for fear, as arrogant men usually do when confronted by dignity they cannot interpret. He laughed and promised that if she pleased the hall he might let her keep her tongue, which was meant as wit and landed instead like rot in the air. Halfdan, present by the door, said sharply that there are old feast laws against threatening the serving voice before a toast is poured. Rurik waved him off, calling the old law speaker a cupboard of moth-eaten customs, and saying victory gives its own permissions. Halfdan did not answer further, but the look he gave Vesha then was part warning and part question, as though he wondered whether she still carried one of those forgotten customs inside her. When the horn for assembly sounded and the benches filled, Stornhall became a hall of scars trying to look like a hall of strength. Men pounded cups, slapped shields, and lifted axes in salute, while boys too young to have fought imitated them with wooden spoons and breathless admiration. The first toasts were to the gods, to winter endurance, and to the ships that would still float when spring reopened the fjord. The next toasts were to the dead, though the words came fast and shallow in Rurik's mouth, more ritual than sorrow. When Bjorn's name was spoken, the hall quieted in a way it had not for the rest, and even Rurik's grin thinned for a moment into something older and less certain. Jarl Asmund drank longest after that toast and did not immediately set his cup down. Vesha noticed everything, because a keeper of names survives partly by knowing where grief hides when pride is ordered to stand in front of it. The mead round began after the roast trenchers were carried in, and Vesha moved from bench to bench beneath more eyes than any battlefield had turned toward her. Some warriors mocked openly, asking whether Ashfang blood watered the mead sweeter, whether orc hands knew how to pour without stealing, whether her people wailed as badly in defeat as in battle. Others, especially the older men, said little, and watched with the discomfort of those who feel a line has been crossed, but lack the appetite to stop the crossing mid-feast. A few even lowered their gaze when she filled their cups, as though shame and obedience had made awkward companions in them. When she came to Captain Ivar, he accepted the pitcher with a brief nod and poured his own cup instead of making her lean closer, a small act that nevertheless landed in Vesha's memory. When she came to Halfdan, the old law speaker spoke quietly in an older trader's dialect, hardly used anymore, and asked whether she knew the road song of Stag Pass. Vesha's hand tightened almost invisibly on the mead handle, and she answered in the same dialect that she knew not only Stag Pass but the winter verses of the crossing law. Halfdan closed his eyes for half a breath as if some old fear had just become real, then murmured that if the hall presses you to sing, weigh your choice against what may follow. Vesha asked whether Stornhall still remembers enough to deserve being weighed against anything. Before he could answer, Rurik called from the centre floor that the captive had poured the hall well and now owed them the better part of the sport. He rose with his cup and motioned for Vesha to stand in the open space between the benches and the high seat where skalds usually sang on feast nights. A murmur of anticipation ran through the warriors, half-drunk curiosity and half-hunger for humiliation that did not fall on themselves. Rurik announced that since the Ashfang sang so loudly on the march, Stornhall deserved to hear what tune remained after a tribe lost its pride. He lifted his axe overhead with a grin, and many younger warriors, eager to mirror their new hero, raised theirs as well in rough approval. The torchlight flashed along iron edges until the whole centre of the hall seemed ringed by teeth. Astrid stood very still by the women's side benches, one hand tightened around the serving board so hard her knuckles whitened. Halfdan leaned forward on his staff, and Captain Ivar's jaw set as if he were deciding whether disobedience might be less ugly than the next few minutes. Jarl Asmund said nothing, but his silence had become so heavy by then that it felt less like command and more like a battlefield he had not chosen how to cross. Rurik told Vesha to sing the fall of Ashfang or the death of her wolf mother, or any other piece of defeat the hall might enjoy before the next barrel was opened. Vesha looked first at him, then at the raised axes, then at Asmund on the high seat, and finally at the benches where men who had killed her kin now waited to hear her break for their amusement. What rose in her chest then was not fear exactly, though fear was there, but a colder certainty that if she allowed them to define the song, then the dead of Black Slope would be buried under laughter forever. So she drew one slow breath and began not with the shrill opening of a mock lament, but with a low note so old and steady it seemed to come from under the floorboards themselves. Halfdan inhaled sharply enough for those nearest him to turn, because he knew the tune at once. It was the First Road Lament, the passage song once used in the far north when fjord clans and mountain tribes still shared burial ground at storm borders and swore not to raise steel while the dead were being named. The old law held that when the First Road Lament was sung by a true namekeeper, every weapon within hearing must lower until the final name crossed the singer's lips. Few in Stornhall younger than Halfdan had ever heard the law spoken, much less the song itself, but customs older than memory sometimes strike the body before the mind catches up. Halfdan rose on trembling legs and called out, not loudly but with the crack of authority that once judged duels and ship claims, "Axes down by the road law of the dead." Captain Ivar lowered his axe first without hesitation. Then 2 veterans beside him did the same, and then 3 more who had traded in northern valleys in their youth, and then the motion spread bench by bench like a ripple through dark water. The younger warriors looked confused and half ready to laugh until they saw their elders' faces, saw even Jarl Asmund slowly lower the ceremonial axe beside his seat, and realized mockery had already become dangerous sacrilege. Rurik held out longest, his arms still raised, his expression caught between anger and disbelief. Vesha never looked at him as she sang the second line, only at the smoke-dark rafters and the invisible road she was opening for the dead. The note changed then, gathering names into itself the way a river gathers thaw water, and every warrior in the hall felt the air alter from triumph to witness. At last, under the weight of every eye and every lowered blade, Rurik dropped his axe point grudgingly toward the floor. The hall had gone so quiet that mead dripping from a ladle somewhere near the kitchen sounded indecently loud. Vesha sang first the names of Ashfang who fell at Black Slope, each name paired with parent line, campfire, and the manner of their final stand. She named Uran of Split Pine, who died with his shield cracked over 2 children, Micah Red Ear, who burned the stores rather than let them feed the enemy, and Radka Wolf Mother, who took a spear at the gate while shouting the retreat line for the youngest to run. Some in the hall shifted impatiently at hearing enemy dead honored in the center of their feast, but no one raised a weapon again. Then, without pause, Vesha changed the cadence and began naming Stornhall's fallen too. She named Torsten Reed-Arm, who bled out near the eastern trench calling for his brother, and Hallie Thin-Braid, who died trying to drag a wounded boy clear of a burning cart. Murmurs ran the benches now, because many in the hall had not spoken some of those details aloud, even among themselves. Vesha could only know them if she had been there among the dying after the shield wall broke. She had indeed been there, not as scavenger or mocker, but with bandage cloth and the cup of last water, moving between both sides while arrows still fell thinly in the dusk. When she named Bjorn Asmundsen, the entire hall stiffened. She did not call him enemy or victor, only Bjorn, son of Asmund, broad shield at the breach, who gave his breath after 3 children were carried through the fire gap, and whose blood lay warm beside Ashfang and Stornhall alike. Jarl Asmund's fingers tightened around the carved arm of his high seat until the knuckles blanched pale. Rurik looked up sharply at that line, because it did not match the story he had brought home from Black Slope. He had told the hall that Bjorn died in the glorious final charge, cut down facing the Ashfang stockade after refusing to yield an inch. Vesha's words painted something different. A breach, a fire gap, and children in the middle of battle where no children ought to have been at all. She sang on, giving no space for interruption, and the song gathered details like sparks caught in wool. She named the 3 children Bjorn carried. 1 Stornhall shepherd boy taken in the confusion, and 2 Ashfang girls hidden in a grain pit when the camp caught fire. She named also the truce cloth laid at noon that day, white hide on a spear shaft, and the parley call that should have held both sides apart while non-fighters were moved from the stockade. Halfdan's head lifted at that, and Captain Ivar turned toward Rurik with a stare sharpened by sudden memory. For it had been Rurik, impatient with delay and eager for the last glory, who shouted that the orcs were stalling and ordered the forward push before the parley had fully concluded. Vesha's song did not accuse in the crude language of argument. It merely placed the sequence of truth into the hall with the weight of witnessed names behind it. She sang that the white hide dropped when an axe flew too soon, that panic took both lines, that fire caught the dry barrier stakes, and that Bjorn cursed his own side louder than the enemy when he realized children remained inside. She sang that Bjorn broke from the charge, ran through the breach with Vesha and 2 Ashfang women, and together they dragged little bodies out while men on both sides lost sense under smoke and fury. She sang that Bjorn died, not seeking fame, but covering the retreat of children whose names most victors would never have cared to learn. By the time she reached the end of that verse, even the youngest warriors in the hall understood that the song had become more than mourning. It had become judgment carried in a form no one could lawfully interrupt. Rurik tried anyway. He barked that the orc woman lied, that grief had made a theatre of the feast, and that no captive's tune should outweigh a son of Stornhall's word. Halfdan struck his staff on the floor so hard the crack rang like a snapped spear, and declared that under the road law, any man breaking the lament before the last name makes himself oath-burned before witness. That stopped even Rurik for a heartbeat, because Stornhall might forget old customs until inconvenient, but it still feared the stain of publicly broken sacred law. Vesha used the silence to sing the final name of the battle, not Ashfang or Stornhall, but the unnamed child with the burned scarf, buried between lines until memory claims him. Then she let the last note fade upward into the rafters where smoke curled around beams blackened by generations of feast fires. No one moved at first. The whole hall seemed to listen for the dead to object, and when no such objection came, the living had to face each other with the song still hanging between them. Jarl Asmund stood, which by itself forced the room to attention more effectively than any shout. He asked Vesha, not unkindly and not gently, whether she had truly stood beside Bjorn when he died. Vesha answered that she held Bjorn's shoulders when his knees gave way, and that his last words were not for victory, but for his father to keep Rurik away from power until he learned what battle costs outside his own skin. That struck Asmund like a second spear, one driven by the dead through the mouth of a captive singer. Astrid bowed her head then, not in surprise, but in the grim recognition of a suspicion long nursed finally made plain. Captain Ivar stepped forward before Rurik could recover the room, and said he had indeed seen the white truce hide raised at midday. He had also heard Rurik order the advance before the envoy line fully cleared, though in the chaos afterward he let the prince's version stand because the dead were too many and the hall too hungry for a clean victory. Halfdan called that silence what it was. Cowardice wrapped in grief, understandable perhaps, but still a silence that had now ripened into danger. Rurik's face went red with fury, shame, or both, and he accused them all of letting an enemy woman enchant their reason. He said Bjorn was dead, and enemies were dead, and the hall still stood, which proved the gods had favored the stronger hand. Vesha answered him, then, not in song, but in plain northern speech, that the gods may permit many things in a battle frenzy, but memory is what decides whether the permitted becomes honorable. Several warriors near the mid-benches lowered their eyes, because they had mocked her minutes earlier, and now understood she had carried their brothers' final names more faithfully than they had. One grizzled veteran named Sten took off his arm ring and placed it on the floor before Asmund, saying Bjorn deserved better remembrance than a feast built on a lie. Another followed by setting down his cup untouched. Soon a line of such gestures spread, not dramatic enough to be rebellion, but unmistakable as censure. Rurik saw the mood turning and reached instinctively for the nearest sure remedy in violent men: force. He seized Vesha by the arm and drew his short blade, snarling that if the hall wished peace with songs, it could have it after he cut the singer from the throat that bewitched them. Captain Ivar moved first, catching Rurik's wrist before the blade could rise more than a handspan. Astrid came down from the side benches with a speed that startled even the guards, and struck her brother across the face with the flat of a serving board, shouting that he would not spill feast blood over Bjorn's witness. The absurdity of the blow did not lessen its effect. It broke the moment's straight line toward murder just enough for reason to regain purchase. Jarl Asmund's voice finally came like winter surf against stone when he ordered Rurik to release the captive and surrender his blade. For one dangerous second father and son stood opposed before the whole hall, and the future of Stornhall seemed balanced between them more nakedly than any succession council could have arranged. Rurik let go only when he realized that if he defied the command now, he would be opposing not merely a grieving father, but the hall's full moral weight under sacred witness. He dropped the blade, though not his glare, and backed away with the look of a man who feels humiliation entering him like slow poison. Asmund told the guards to keep him to the outer bench until the feast judgment was settled. No one cheered, because the hall had crossed beyond cheering and into reckoning. It was Halfdan who then pointed out the most immediate consequence of the song besides truth itself. If Vesha was indeed a true namekeeper of Ashfang, and if she had sung the First Road Lament lawfully within Stornhall, then by old border custom she now stood under death guest protection until the next dawn. That meant no harm could lawfully come to her inside the hall without staining the entire household. It also meant, as Halfdan added in a voice dry as old bark, that any surviving Ashfang hearing of the song would judge Stornhall by what it did with the protection it had just publicly accepted. Captain Ivar then delivered worse news still. Scouts posted on the North Rise before the feast had reported movement in the outer woods, perhaps only a handful of riders at first, but enough to suggest Ashfang survivors had trailed the victory column back or were testing the hall's defences. Rurik laughed bitterly and said there was the proof he needed, for the singer had delayed them with tears while her people gathered outside. Vesha answered that if Ashfang riders were near, then they had likely come looking for captives or names, not for blind slaughter, unless Stornhall chose to greet them as liars and corpse thieves. Asmund asked her plainly whether she could call them back from attack. Vesha said she could call them to parley if the hall returned the dead tokens taken at Black Slope, brought forth any living captives, and let the crossing refrain be sung from the gate as witness of good faith. Rurik scoffed that she asked terms like a victor. Vesha replied that the dead care little which side thought it won, only whether the living can still behave, as though law matters after blood dries. Asmund looked over the hall then, at the lowered axes, the arm rings on the floor, the face of his dead son suddenly altered in all their minds, and the son still living who had made that alteration necessary. He ordered the feast tables cleared from the centre and the dead tokens from Black Slope brought from the spoil chest. He also ordered that every captive taken at the battle, whether Ashfang or lowland thrall swept up in the chaos, be accounted for, and brought under guard to the hall doors. That command alone told Stornhall the night had turned completely away from victory celebration and into something older, stranger, and far more important. Vesha was given back the tally strings and marked hide slips that Rurik's men had taken from her belt after capture, for without them, Halfdan acknowledged, a namekeeper is half mutilated. She accepted them with visible effort, as though touching those scraps in front of the men who made them necessary demanded more composure than any song had. Outside, snow had begun to fall again in light, hard grains that hissed on the torch baskets set beside Stornhall's doors. Captain Ivar led a guard line to the yard, but this time their axes were held low, points toward the ground, in the posture Halfdan prescribed for road law witness. Vesha walked between Asmund and Astrid to the threshold, the first time she had crossed the hall openly without rope or mockery since her capture. On the ridge beyond the outer fence, dark shapes waited among the birches. Perhaps 15 Ashfang survivors, cloaks white with snow, wolfskin banners tied in mourning knots. At their front stood Hradka's brother Orvan Skarai, old enough to remember the border laws even if grief had made him eager to forget them. When he saw Vesha alive on the threshold, he lifted his spear half in joy and half in disbelief. When he saw also the Jarl beside her and Stornhall's axes lowered, his war cry died before it fully formed. Vesha sang then the crossing refrain, short and formal this time, naming herself alive, naming Black Slope unfinished, and naming the hall under witness until dawn. Orvan answered with the Ashfang reply, and the sound of it passing back across the snow made several younger Vikings shiver because it felt less like negotiation and more like an ancient door opening. Parley was held in the yard beneath torchlight while half the hall peered from the doors and arrow slits, unwilling to miss the shape of history while still uncertain whether it meant peace or disaster. Vesha named the captives returned, the dead tokens restored, and the 3 children Bjorn had helped save, 2 of whom Ashfang now sheltered and one already back with Stornhall kin. Orvan demanded blood payment for Hradka and the broken truce at Black Slope. Before Asmund could answer, Vesha said the blood debt had already begun counting against Stornhall in the hall itself and would not be honestly measured if settled by a yard skirmish under witness law. She asked instead for dawn burial rites at Black Slope, open passage for Ashfang dead collectors, and public truth in Stornhall regarding Bjorn's death and Rurik's premature charge. Asmund, hearing his son judged not by enemies alone but by the woman whose people he wronged, gave the hardest assent of his life and agreed. He further swore that Rurik would stand in a judgment before Spring Council, and that Halfdan would record the truth of Black Slope in both Stornhall and border law. Orvan lowered his spear then, not because grief had lessened, but because the offer carried law, witness, and the dead son of the enemy all bound into one hard promise. The Ashfang riders did not enter the hall that night, but neither did they raid it. Instead, they camped under torch truce beyond the fence while Stornhall reopened its doors, not for revelry, but for mourning and testimony. Before dawn, the victory feast had become awake, and the mead once meant to celebrate conquest was poured instead as memory cups for Ashfang and Stornhall alike. When the first grey of morning touched the fjord, every warrior who had lifted an axe in Mockery the night before carried it lowered behind Vesha and Asmund as they walked together toward Black Slope to bury the dead properly. And if anyone later asked how an orc woman forced to serve mead at a victory feast made every warrior lower his axe when she sang, the truest answer was this. Her voice carried an older law than pride, and once she placed truth, grief, and the names of the dead back into the center of the hall, even the fiercest men remembered that no victory is honorable if it must be defended against memory itself. If you want more stories from Orc Chronicles, stay with me for the next one.